YouTube, I want you to think really quickly. What were you doing 1,473 days ago? Okay. Now, I know that that might be hard. Think about your favorite team. Could be esports, could be real sports. Who was their starting roster 1,473 days ago? Well, it's cheating somewhat, but the story that we're going to talk about today, if you are part of that five-man roster of Virtus Pro, it'd be real easy because it didn't change for 1,473 days. Now, Virtus Pro has been a staple of Counter Strike for a really long time. It's a Russian organization, but for a really long time, the time frame that we're going to talk about, it was only Polish players. So I, and I'm sure many other people, had the mistaken thought that it was a Polish organization, but that doesn't really matter. Now, Virtus Pro has been in Counter Strike since the start of Counter Strike Go, and they're still going strong today. They are definitely not at the heights they were at this time, but they're still competing and they're still in it, which is very surprising for an organization to have that long lasting value. But I guess it shouldn't be a surprise because, again, this is a story of long and unexpected tenures. So, in this time period, the five-man roster was all picked up together of Polish players going into Virtus Pro. Why don't we meet them? That is going to start with Taz, the leader, the spiritual leader as well, a guy who just was always an incredibly cerebral player and just always understood the game at a level that a lot of other people didn't. And as a testament to that, he is still going as a coach. He is still coaching and still having success. And just recently, of the date of this video, won a tournament with BC Game. He always was leading the line as the IGL, and I think really set the tone. I think Taz is a really good player to start with because he really sets the tone for the rest of the roster. But next, and maybe the most important for this time period, was Snax. Now, Snax, in terms of the roster at least, was the young gun here, and he was just a very fun player to watch. Always had crazy highlights, crazy clutches, was just one of those players that always seemed to have kind of that instinctual understanding of the game, and it would always come through in crazy moments, things that you would never expect, funny moments, just flanks and trigger discipline. There's so many Snax highlights. He might be one of the more frequently highlighted players in the history of Counter-Strike and was just a very flashy player for this roster. Next is byali. Also just as young, I think a year younger than Snax actually, but the reason I don't call him a young gun is that he was always the anchor player. He was the player that was kind of stuck in bad spots or forced to entry, did the really dirty jobs for the rest of the team, and was really an unsung hero for it. Was just that missing piece for this team. Just one of those players that you don't really notice it when you're watching, but was always just a very solid player to complete everybody else. Next, maybe the player that people know the most about, but Pasha Biceps. Oh man. I don't think people today know as much about him as they used to, but Pasha was a huge personality. As the name suggests, very, very muscular and very just fun to watch and a very just interesting personality again. But he was the Opper. And Pasha is a funny player because as I know him when I started watching towards the end of this core, to me was always just kind of a solid player. But through the beginning stages of this VP roster was an incredibly talented Opper for the team and was just a very signifying player for them to have an Opper that talented yet be so physically strong and imposing. Just was such a juxtaposition that I think really represented this team. And last, certainly not least though, we'll talk about Neo. Now, I feel like Neo was really before my time as well. But anybody who's some kind of historian in Counter-Strike knows that Neo was a prodigy in 1.6 and was just an incredibly talented player during that time. And so it was just so, smart to bring a player like that onto this team. And he was really just the stable piece. He was like the star rifler, just always put up numbers and was incredibly good for the team, And if you look at the dynamics, it just worked so well. So to give an overview of the team, you had Taz leading the way in terms of spirit and brain power. You had Snacks, who was the young gun, the you would probably say the star of the team, but going for highlights, going for crazy plays, plays that you want to think about. You would have Bialy pulling up the caboose. But people say that negatively, I say that positively. He was the unsung hero, the guy doing jobs that nobody else could and was just really good at it. Pasha, the muscular, manly man of an opper for the team, sitting there, really wide on the keyboard, opping fools down. And then you complete it with just an all-around star player who's been doing it since the previous iteration of the game and just continued his star rifling into Counter-Strike Go. Now, before we get into the real reason for the video, I just want to give basically some props to Virtus Pro and some context around it. I think Virtus Pro had the personalities that everybody loved, and that's why everybody remembers them. I think there was another slight twist to that too, where they were successful. Don't get me wrong, they won tournaments here and there, but they only won one major in those 4 years. And I think it was really easy to root for them, right? Because I think a lot of other teams, if you have sustained success, you basically just people root against you. But Virtus Pro always had the personalities and the consistent success, but never that really winning every tournament vibe. You could best be assured that they were comfortably better than their opposition. And I think that there is a level of expectation with them that they were essentially the gatekeepers, right? They were always in that, semi-final range of a tournament. And if you beat them, you knew that you were good enough to win. They were always there, and they always beat up teams that were worse than them. And that added to their level of competitiveness, that they were always there and they were always better than the teams below them. And I think that's how you got a lot of people to really endear them. And they really endeared themselves to people, and their aggression, Snacks doing these crazy plays, personalities like Pasha, like Taz, really just made people like them. And if you didn't know, Virtus Plow is their nickname. That's because, again, they had a specific playstyle that, in my opinion, I think is lost anymore. Having a full Polish roster for 4 years straight, I don't think could ever happen in today's Counter-Strike, and really in today's sports as well. And I think it's missing because if you look at back at those times, I think it's the glory days, because you would have Virtus Pro, you'd have teams like NiP who probably overshadowed them. There wasn't as much overlap, but a team like NiP comes through, they're all the Swedish stars and win every tournament. I think that's who a lot of people compared Virtus Pro to or tried to, and it was just never really that level of success, because again, that competition with those regional rosters came in. So you still had NiP, you had a few French rosters, then you had, a Danish every now and then, right? And then a couple Russians rosters in there. And so you just had these really distinct regional styles. And we can't forget about, if you want to call them Luminosity, SK, whatever you would like to call them, who all had their distinct styles. And I think people could just root for them. And it was really interesting to see them go for those full 4 years and to have that success, but not the top end success that makes people hate you. Really, people liked them for that entire 4 years, which is basically unheard of. So now let's contextualize, right? 4 years does sound crazy, but like how crazy? And in that sense, it's really simple. For a player to stay on a roster, the average amount of time is 8 and 10 months. That's one player on one roster. Now, the full 5-man roster to stay together, that's only about 6 months, right? Esports is so demanding nowadays that, like, you have to. If things aren't working or you're not having success, you're going to make a change. Let's talk about the French Shuffle era, because I think that really signifies the difficulties that typically one region teams came up against. Now, we take a look at some of these really good teams that the French were able to create, G2, those types of teams. even those super teams were really only able to stay together for 10 months. And an average player's time, given one player on one team, was about, 8 to 10 months. And I just think it really shows what you were up against is that getting 5 people from the same region was not always a recipe for success. And what a lot of regions got locked into is just recycling. And because they were familiar enough, it was seen as easier, right? Oh, this player's already been there before, or oh, we know who this player is, so we could just bring them in and it would be an easy fix, right? Well, wrong. And you saw that here. The average French roster, full 5-man roster, staying together was between 3 and 6 months. Okay? Now, that is what you're really facing when you're a one region team and, one region couple of teams, is that because of the familiarity, you might be baited into, oh, we can just really quickly bring something in. That's not going to work. Then another really interesting aspect is we talk about success. Well, a team being successful usually will make them stay together longer. But even talking about the most famous example in Counter-Strike, Ninjas in Pajamas, that only worked for the first 2 years. To be exact, it was 27 months for their really dominant roster to stay together. Now, yes, I think it was Forest and Get Right were there very long term. I think it was almost upwards of 7 years that individually they were there. But it got to a point where after those 27 months of dominance, because they weren't at that same level, right? They weren't winning every tournament. They still felt as though they had to make a change. And then they had that famous period where they were shuffling players every couple of months. And for them, it was about an average of around 10 months where a new player would come in. So that's where we get this really interesting comparison where even with success, once you drop down, there's a really quick and kind of bait there where teams think that, oh, we'll make a change and we'll get back up there. But for Virtus Pro, it's really interesting because they had that level of success, but didn't get baited into making those changes and stuck it out when those troughs would come in. And because they didn't always get towards the mountain, there wasn't that push. There wasn't that push to always need to change. And they're lucky they weren't, because again, they don't want to become the French where they shuffle in the same players every so often and get to the point where it's every 6 months they got a new player. So again, even in that context of during that time frame, famous rosters like the NIP dominant era and the French shuffle really just puts into perspective the keys to Virtus Pro staying together and how rare it was. So why don't we take a look at what I think is the closest example in real sports with basketball, the NBA. And there, the average duration for a player is still only between 2 and 4 years. And that's again with the bench, where even if you're not a starter, you can still be on the bench and contribute and be on that team for that long, right? For the full 5-man roster, the starters to stay together is really only 1 and 2 years, right? You think about it, if you didn't win the championship, people are going to ask questions. And for everybody's peaks to stay the same and to be on the same schedule is basically unheard of. And so that's why for the NBA even, it's really only 1 to 2 years for a full 5-man roster. And then even when you add in the bench, because it's so demanding, it's really only between 2 and I found a maximum of 4 years. So that's why it's so crazy to me, right? You have the NBA with full rosters, or even just being on a roster and not playing, right? You could have that full 12-man roster in the NBA, and even that, the average duration is really only between 2 and 4 years. So for Virtus Pro in esports, that you don't have a bench, right? If you're gone, you're gone. For that starting 5 for Virtus Pro to stay together and continue to play, continue to be together for 4 years is just insane. Now, why don't we go into a little bit about what allowed that to happen and probably why it won't happen again? Main one being is the regional rosters, right? We talked about it before. It was a full Polish 5-man lineup. It was very hard to find a full Polish lineup and then replace one Polish player for one player and still try to find the same level of success, right? Trying to limit your player pool to only Poland and then find a suitable replacement is a lot more demanding than it is nowadays, where, oh, you just search the entire world and just bring in a player that fits. Your player pool was a lot more restrictive than that. Also, I think that was a lot more competitive. I think a lot more teams, when you had regional rivalries, didn't want to just give you the player, right? If you think about it, if you take Poland, I'm sure the second best Polish team didn't want to just give their best player to Virtus Pro, right? So you just have this level of competition and this level of rivalry where you're kind of stuck. You picked up these 5 players. They're the best players that you could find. It's going to be pretty difficult to just go out with that limited player pool and just find another. The second, and probably the more specific to this team, is sustained success, but not sustained winning, right? And I think there's like almost a double-edged sword to it, right? I think a team that wins so much eventually will have guys either burn out or, want to leave and be the star somewhere else, right? I think that's happened with Astralis is probably the best example, where like they won so long that like they won every tournament and then got burned out by it, that they were like, nah, we'll take a break, and then just never kind of reassembled. And you're always chasing that high. Since everybody has their sights set on you, I'm sure it gets a lot more tiring than the other way around. And so that's why for Virtus Pro to just be in the mix for that long is very, very, I guess, advantageous for them, right? Like they were always good enough, but just never seemed to consistently do it. So, it was like, what is there to change, right? And the last thing is it's probably back then, it was a little bit less cutthroat. And specifically what I'm saying is not that it was teams weren't trying to win, but I think esports was a little bit more unique as opposed to traditional sports, in that I think loyalty and brand recognition was huge. So for a team like Virtus Pro, who I'm sure was very popular, maybe not jersey sales back then, but at least in terms of like merch, in terms of attention, in terms of being watched and being one of the teams that people gravitate towards, is a big deal. And so when you have that, I think the owners of Virtus Pro at the time, whatever it was, were a little bit more lenient in terms of not cutting somebody right away, because they're successful enough and there's enough attention on them that you may as well just stick together. What you have now can never really be replicated. You always know if you shuffle the eggs in the cart, one of them's going to break. And so they're successful enough and well known enough that why would you change, right? And so I think that's what allows that whole 4 years to really be a no-brainer. It was like, if they don't want to leave, then why would anybody force them to? And I think as well, if you add on to that, I think there were unique players. I think maybe specifically because it was a Polish team and maybe the English wasn't as good, so they weren't as comfortable just going to an international roster. That part I'm not sure about. I don't know the players in depth enough to know that. But I'm sure some of those things played a part. And then most likely just the fact that they liked each other enough, right? They just enjoyed playing on the same team as each other. So why would you shuffle? Again, even the players knew and were content enough not to shuffle any of the things that made them special. And if we flip that into why I don't think it'll happen again, I just think that, number one, teams are more international. Everybody speaks English for the most part, mainly because of like things like FPL or pugging. Like, there's an expectation that you at least have to be not conversational, but like in-game conversational in English, and it would probably be fine. And so I think it's just a lot more reasonable for teams to move around. I think second, I just think that things are a lot more just about winning. I think players are more able to create their own brand. It's not necessarily as tied to teams as it was. And then they're able to be their brand in and of themselves and then win with a team. So they're trying to go to a team that wins the most and then just create their own brand. And I think that that's what happens is people aren't as interested in, oh, here's the 5 guys and we're going to be a special team altogether. It's, hey, I'm my brand, and then whatever team I'm going to join is just to win. And then I think on top of that, you also add in the fact that teams are much more incentivized with VRS and with the Louvre agreement and all that stuff to be at the top, that there's just not as much acceptance with teams that aren't actively winning. And so I think it's just, you're really not going to see a team like that, especially at the top level. Don't get me wrong, you'll probably see teams stick together, maybe for like tier 2, things like that. But a team like Virtus.pro with such a distinct play style, staying together for 4 years will never happen again. And I just want to say one more time, 1,473 days. I don't think that that's ever going to be topped. And let me know, guys, what do you think? If there's a team out there that's longer, if you know a record that I don't, you'll have to let me know. Otherwise, what do you think? Do you have any other teams like that? Maybe a team that isn't your favorite team, but like maybe outside of your favorite team, your second, your most favorite to watch? Because that was always Virtus.pro for me. I always had Cloud9 at that time, and then it was like Virtus.pro was always the team that I would look at and kind of root for. Any other teams like that for you guys where you like rooting for them and during that time you like to support? Otherwise, I appreciate everybody's support. If you got this far, if you wouldn't mind throwing a subscribe my way, I'd be appreciative of it. Trying to grow the channel, trying to make all the videos better. So any of your feedback, any of your comments would be greatly appreciated. But yeah, guys, 4 years. Hopefully, whatever I'm doing in 1,473 days from now, maybe we're a millionaire at that time. That's what I'm going to root for. So remember this, 1,473 days in the future, we're going to be big time. See you next time.